Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor. I'm a Sony imaging ambassador, and I'd like to talk to you about the Alpha 7R cameras. Now, I first encountered the original Alpha 7R camera back in 2013 as a pre-production model, and it took me a little bit by surprise, a very pleasant surprise. I was amazed that Sony had managed to get a full-frame sensor behind their E-mount mirrorless cameras. Now, the camera was no bigger than the Micro Four Thirds Olympus mirrorless cameras, and that is quite an achievement. The camera instantly reminded me of the form factor I'd been using with the analog cameras I'd been using in the 1980s and 1990s, and I actually had thought that the cameras, the modern digital cameras, were getting a little bit big as the old analog medium format cameras, in fact. Now, the original sensor of that A7R, it was an amazing sensor. It had beautiful dynamic range, and when matched with one of the early Zeiss lenses, such as this 1635 f4 Zeiss lens, we had great sharpness as well. And I was an instant fan of this form factor, and I had many of enjoyable experiences by using this in a landscape setting. Now, I have to admit that the original Alpha 7R camera had no phase detect autofocus, so it basically was incapable of shooting and refocusing on things in continuous motion. So I carried on using a camera with a mirror, Sony's Alpha 99 DSLT, because this had fast autofocus in continuous autofocus mode. So I didn't get rid of all of my mirrored cameras when the first Alpha 7R came out. But I didn't have to wait too long. Just 18 months or so later, we got the version 2. And this did have phase detect autofocus. Not only did it have phase detect autofocus, it was very quick. Now, I actually captured this image using the original A-mount 70 to 400 lens adapted through the LA-EA3 converter, and we could use the on-sensor phase detect autofocus. And so I was immediately struck by the fact that now I could achieve with the mirrorless cameras not just the high resolution of that 36 megapixel sensor, but I could also use that camera to shoot my action and portraits on the move. And so this was the turning point for me as a photographer, where I put all of my mirrored cameras, my DSLRs, up for sale. Now, the beauty of having this phase detect autofocus on a 36 megapixel sensor was the croppability. Now, I only occasionally print very large prints, but I often want to crop very aggressively to get that tight crop. Now, this is a 4K image, so I've lost no quality by cropping this tightly on an Alpha 7R camera, and that is the beauty of the R cameras, is instead of maybe using a 600 or 800 mil focal length, we can simply use a 400 mil focal length and then crop quite aggressively in post-production. Another great thing came with that Alpha 7R2, and that was the in-body image stabilization, steady shot inside. This allowed me to hand hold images at very slow shutter speeds. This is handheld at 1/5 of a second. I'm shooting with the aperture closed down to f11, and I'm keeping the ISO at a low 100. So I'm losing no quality, but I've managed to leave the tripod at home. So again, this was a big turning point for the mirrorless systems. The high ISO performance also increased with the second generation of our camera. So I'm more than able to shoot something like this at ISO 5000, do a little bit of post-production noise reduction there, and have this go to a large print or a double page spread in a magazine. One of the other features that came in with the Alpha 7R2 was the IAF in continuous autofocus. So I could be moving, or the model could be moving, and the camera would hold focus on that eye, even when using lenses with very shallow depth of field, such as the 85mm f1.4 G Master lens. And for those times where IAF wouldn't kick in, this predates animal IAF, I would simply use DMF, direct manual focus, to push that focus back from the tip of the nose, the nearest part of the subject to the camera, and then push it back to the eyes of this monkey. So again, improvements were on the horizon. I always referred to as the 2 as a camera for all reasons. It did allow me to shoot portraits, action and landscapes. It was a camera that basically could turn its hand to any genre. So what could Sony do to improve on this already sophisticated camera that I was enjoying? Well, we got the 42 megapixel sensor on the Mark II, and there was no change for the Mark III. So we had that image quality, but what we got was ergonomics. We got the Z series battery, more than double the life. For many photographers, that battery will take them through the entire day. We got the dual card slot. One of those slots was a fast UHS-2 slot, and this allowed me, with this fast slot, increased buffer size to shoot birds in flight and also motorsports. So with that bigger buffer, I could just keep my finger pressed on the shutter release for far longer and to ensure that I got the decisive moment. So focus speed, focus area, buffer capacity, and also frames per second went from 5 to 10. So it certainly took a leap towards becoming a sports photographer, a sports camera, as well as a landscape and portrait camera. And just to prove that point, I'm at the MotoGP with an A9 and a 400mm G Master lens, but I need to capture the motorcycles coming over the brow of the hill, one turn away from where I'm currently standing. Now this was beyond the reach of the Alpha 9, so I simply put the 400mm lens on my A7R III, put the 1.4 times teleconverter on, went into APS-C mode, dropping the resolution to 18 megapixels, and this allowed me to capture this image. And so certainly this camera had a raison d'etre even in a sporting context. Now, just to talk about that APS-C mode in a little bit more detail, yes, we can use APS-C mode in the Alpha 9 and Alpha 7 III cameras, but if you do, you will drop the resolution to just over 10 megapixels. If you're trying to take a 4K crop, 3840 pixels on the long dimension from that image, it is very tight. You've got little more wiggle room than just to straighten the image before you run out of croppability. If you crop any further, you will go below the 4K resolution, and if those images are being displayed on a 4K monitor, they'll have to be upscaled, and you will lose a little bit of quality by doing that. If I compare that with a 4K crop from that 42 megapixel sensor, you can see we do have that croppability. We are able to crop really aggressively. Some people say you don't need this many megapixels. Well, this is a case in point where if you do want to crop much tighter because you simply don't have the reach on your longest telephoto lens, then the A7R cameras do give you that capability. And just to prove that point, here we're going into that 4K crop. No compromise of image quality. I'm using a G Master lens and I haven't come down below that 4K crop dimensions there. The dynamic range also carried on improving through the R cameras, and so we were able to shoot an image like this with very dark shadow tones because I'm protecting the highlight tones. I don't want to clip the brightest tones in the sky, and then I can simply raise those shadow tones in post-production, and the quality in those shadows is not, it can't be bettered by any other sensor on the market. The only other cameras that can come close to this are the Nikon full frame sensors, but the only reason that is possible is because Sony make their sensors for them. Now, improved IF was another feature of the R3. The cameras became more comfortable with picking faces even when turned slightly away from the camera. So the IAF is engaging now with this portrait in profile view. We don't need, or the camera doesn't need, both eyes to recognize this is a face, this is the eye in the face. And so I'm using another short telephoto lens now at maximum aperture and just nailing that focus. 98% of the time I don't have to worry about the focus when using these wide aperture prime lenses. Now, one of the things that we also had with the 3 is by a firmware upgrade later in the cycle of this camera, we were introduced to animal IF. So I could sort of abandon that DMF technique I was talking about earlier and now just allow the camera to find the eye. So the camera pushes beyond the nose of the animal and then picks up the eye, and I get these pin sharp images of eyes now. And also with the ARC came that increased high ISO performance, so I can shoot portraits handheld without flash after the sun has set. This is using the 135 f1.8 maximum aperture with the ISO raised to 1000, and there is no loss in quality. It's a very comfortable ISO for these full frame cameras. Now, if necessary, you can actually push the ISO much higher in a sporting context. Yes, you'll have a little bit of noise, but this image is actually unprocessed and no one is going to be shouting about noise in this image. And we can clean up that image, this image slightly by just doing a small amount of noise reduction in post-processing. Then we got the 4. Okay, so the 4 allowed me to carry on doing the camera for all reasons approach. So it allowed me to carry on taking portraits with even more resolution. It allowed me to shoot action. This is using the 135. Some people consider this as a portrait lens, but it's got the dual linear XD focus motors, so it can really pull focus really quickly. And this is absolutely stunning when you see this on a high definition monitor, the accuracy of focusing. The focus tracking also improved on the Alpha 7R 4. We lost the older lock-on AF and acquired the new AF tracking that we see in the Alpha 9 cameras. This is improved reliability of tracking. It's less likely to let go of the subject whilst tracking a sequence. And we had even more dynamic range. Some people will say if you increase the resolution, the dynamic range has to come down. But Sony keeps on proving this is not the case. As we've increased the resolution from 36 to 42, 42 to 60, then the dynamic range keeps increasing. And so this camera, the dynamic range on this camera is such that I do not need to bracket anymore. I simply lower the exposure to protect the highlights. This is as much as -3 stops on the exposure compensation dial, and then recover those shadows in post-production. So not merging to HDR, simply using one of those dark exposures and fixing the image, or restoring the rich shadow detail in post-production. And these shadow tones are absolutely clean because of that dynamic range. Now, obviously, if you're thinking of going from a 2 or a 3 to the Mark IV, that resolution does have to be the primary factor for you wanting to move forward on this camera. Now, just to highlight that resolution, this is a 4K crop from the full resolution frame. So it does allow you to be extremely flexible in post-production about changing your mind about what it is you want from that image. You can get into a workflow where you just step back a couple of paces and then crop in post, and match this with good glass, and you're going to be rewarded by absolutely stunning resolution and sharpness from this sensor. Now, this is a 24 megapixel vertical crop from the 61 megapixel sensor. So it's quite possible to get very high resolution vertical images without actually having to turn the camera into portrait or vertical mode. And so here is the camera shooting in vertical mode in this instance, but I can go and just show you the 1:1 detail and show you how much detail there is and how much flexibility about changing your mind about, do you want a tight head and shoulder shot or do you want that 3/4 shot? And the resolution gives you the options for both. If you are into printing in very large dimensions, these images that I was shooting for the launch of the Alpha 7R IV in Singapore were printed over 2 meters or 6 feet high, and the resolution was absolutely jaw-dropping when we inspected those prints at close range. One of the flexibilities when using an R camera is we can actually shoot in APS-C mode to get a little bit more reach on the lenses. Here I'm doing a landscape shoot in Yosemite, and this wildlife appears unexpectedly, so I've got a very light 70-200 f4 lens in my messenger bag, so I just put this lens on the camera, went into APS-C mode and captured this image. Now, even shooting in APS-C mode does allow me to crop even quite aggressively down to that 4K resolution. We actually have 26 megapixels in APS-C mode, so which is even higher than the 24 megapixel A7 III and A9 cameras. Now, I actually was shooting this MotoGP with an Alpha 9 II and the 200-600G lens, but just to show you the flexibility of the Alpha 7R IV camera, I actually used an APS-C lens on the Alpha 7R IV, the 70-350, which gives me a full frame equivalent reach of 525 millimeters. Yet this small lens will fit in a small messenger bag, and it's fast focusing, so this gave me the flexibility to shoot motorsports with an APS-C lens on a full frame body. Now, I don't recommend that for everyone. I'm just trying to prove a point here, is flexibility. And one of the other improvements for the Alpha 7R IV was with the AF tracking, we also had touch tracking, both on the monitor, but also using it as a touch pad when using the electronic viewfinder. So we can move between subjects just by putting a thumb on the monitor and move between the rider in the foreground to the rider in the background if we quickly want to change focus point, as I realized the world champion is actually chasing the rider in front. Now, with the Alpha 7R IV again, I'm shooting in APS-C mode, but as we zoom in to the information on that file, the noise will rise slightly. So there is a limit to how much you can zoom in or crop at high ISO and not have the noise start to become more apparent. The noise on the Alpha 7R IV is not better than the A7R III. It's actually a little bit of a step back. So although it's not a problem when shooting at these lower ISO values, it will start to become more noticeable more quickly. So if you were to compare the R3 with the R4 on a site such as DxOMark, you will see, although the dynamic range increased, the high ISO performance decreased slightly. Now, this isn't of a major concern unless you are doing sports, action, and you are cropping aggressively. So I've cropped quite aggressively on this image here just to show you what this image looks like at ISO 800. Now, I have had to clean this image there. The noise was starting to become quite apparent in the background bokeh areas, so I've had to do some localized noise reduction in these areas to get a folio quality image. This is not necessarily something I would have to work quite so hard on with maybe an Alpha 7R III or maybe one of the Alpha 9 cameras. Now, some people will say that the high ISO noise performance is simply not good on these cameras, and that is not true. I'm more than happy to shoot at elevated ISOs on these Alpha 7R IV cameras. This is actually captured at ISO 2,500, and it's only a slight crop on this image, and so the noise is not really becoming very apparent at all because I'm not cropping aggressively in this instance. Now you can actually push much higher. Noise is does have a threshold for some people. Some people become less accepting. I have to point out though, if you're zooming to 1:1 on your monitor and saying that is unacceptable, who else has the capability of zooming in on your images when posted to Instagram, Facebook, or even Flickr? They're not going to be able to see what you're seeing by having the luxury to zoom in on your images. So these images, for instance, that I'm not zooming in on, were actually captured at 12,800 and 6,400. I think they're commercially viable images, but there is a little bit of noise that does need to be managed in post-production there. This is an image that was only slightly cropped, shot of wildlife at 2,500 ISO, and the noise is very manageable when using that full frame and not cropping aggressively. You're not zooming in on that noise, so that noise is not much of a problem. I'll just compare that with noise levels of an Alpha 9, for instance, just so you get an idea of what we're talking about here. This image was captured at ISO 4000 in very low light on a very grey morning, and this is quite a manageable ISO for the Alpha 9. And when I post-process that, no one is going to be noticing the noise pretty much at all. Now, the ISO on the Alpha 9 and also the A7 III is absolutely exceptional. And so when we're looking at elevated ISOs, this is 8,000 ISO on these cameras, we're not really that aware of the noise at all, and we can post-process it out. If we do crop in, yes, I'll be using slightly lower ISOs if I can. I won't not take the image if I can't, but I am more than happy to shoot in APS-C mode or do a 4K crop on these images with ISO 2,500. And this is a post-processed image, so we can see the noise there. Here's another example, this time with the Alpha 7R IV. We're just getting outside of the comfort zone now. We are losing a little bit of the fine detail due to elevated noise levels here at 1000 ISO in APS-C mode with a 4K crop. Now, you can clean these images up, but I would say that the images will look sharper if they had been captured with either an Alpha 7R III or one of the full-frame A9 or A7 III cameras. Now, just to show you that that 24 megapixel crop, basically when you're using an R camera, you do have that extra reach in post-production or shooting in APS-C mode, and so that should not be. We should not underestimate the value of that. This is the 24 megapixel crop from a 62 megapixel image. So you can see how much more croppability these R cameras are giving you. What that means is if you are prepared to drop back down to maybe a 24 megapixel camera to shoot your high ISO sports, action, wildlife, you are going to have to invest in a longer telephoto lenses, so you're not having to crop so much because you don't have that flexibility. So for instance, an Alpha 7R IV user may be happy with their 100-400 GM lens, but to get that close, because you can't crop in post on an Alpha 9 or a 7 III camera, you're going to have to maybe choose the 200-600 so you can physically get closer to your wildlife, so you don't have to crop so much in post. Okay, and obviously that has implications when you're carrying your gear around. So I could get an Alpha 7R camera in a messenger bag with the 100-400, but I'd need a small backpack to carry it with a 200-600. So that is a factor that you have to weigh in. Now, I think probably a sweet spot for somebody who wants resolution and high ISO performance is possibly the Alpha 7R III camera. This is an unprocessed image from the Alpha 7R III at 12,800. Yes, there is noise, but it is sort of manageable in post-production, as I've shown you there. And if people are only viewing your images on social media, they're not even going to mention the subject of noise in these areas here. So this is an Alpha 7R3, a 4K crop of a bird in flight at 2,500 ISO. This is certainly, I think, sort of out of the comfort zone of the Alpha 7R4. Typically, I'd be up at, say, 1,000 ISO on the Alpha 7R4, but here I'm going to 2,500 ISO on the Alpha 7R3. And yes, this can be processed, so it is clean as a whistle and is very commercially viable. Now, if sports action birds in flight is your priority, I have to say that I would personally choose the Alpha 9, not because of its high ISO performance per se, but also just because of its AF tracking. Whenever you've had to track erratic subjects, moving erratically, the lack of blackout when panning and following a subject on an Alpha 9 and its increased reliability of tracking that subject, I sort of have to want to go with an Alpha 9 rather than an Alpha 7R4. Now, if you are going up for that Alpha 7R4 because of the increased resolution, you are obviously going to get many more features. It wasn't just the resolution that was added. We've got probably over 40% more resolution, giving you 40% more flexibility in post-production. We do have that new real-time AF tracking, which is more reliable than the Alpha 7R3. And if you can keep the ISO low because you're using a wide aperture lens or you're photographing in bright ambient conditions, then the Alpha 7R4 is definitely the superior camera to the Alpha 7R3 when shooting action sports. We do have the advantage of a larger buffer, which really showcases itself when we're shooting in APS-C mode. We've got both cards as dual USH2 slots, so both are fast, which again increases its performance for fast action, long continuous sequences. We've got lots of ergonomic improvements, such as the larger grip on the camera. We've got a higher resolution viewfinder. We've got even more AF points. So we've got a lot of features. We've got better weather sealing. The features go on. In fact, we've got faster Wi-Fi transfer. I digress. I'll just point out that there are many benefits from the upgrade to an Alpha 7R4. So long as you're just aware of the high ISO performance is good, but not as good as the Alpha 7R3. And that resolution really does pay off if you're doing advertising work or commercial work, which does need that higher resolution. Okay, so hopefully you found this presentation useful so you can decide whether the R2, the R3 or the R4 camera, or maybe not an R camera at all, is the best choice for a full frame Sony mirrorless camera for you. If this is the first time you've heard me talk, make sure you head over to my website, which is markgaylor.com. All of the learning resources on this website are absolutely free to download, and then you simply pay what you think they're worth. You basically make a donation. So I have a 400-page ebook for the Alpha 7R3 and R3 cameras. I also have a 400-page ebook for the R4. This links out to over 40 video tutorials on YouTube to help you master your camera. It's almost like a class in a book, if you like. And these books these video tutorials that are linked in the ebook are also available on my Alpha Creative Skills YouTube channel. And these will really help you get to master your camera. Now, if you're wanting me as a mentor over the next few months, I do offer this service via Patreon. You can sign up for as little as $5 a month. You can join my Q&A forums. I do a seminar for patrons each month. And I even do live one-on-one meetings for people who are prepared to fork out for that platinum service. Okay, so that completes my presentation about the the Alpha 7R cameras. Okay, I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Imaging Ambassador.